Hey there, how are you? I'm well. Thank you for not asking. Okay, so I have something for you today, which is going to be part two of Dr. Dan Siegel's talk in San Francisco. And it's amazing. Where this starts up is where we left off last time in the last podcast episode, where we went through the Wheel of Awareness practice, the meditative practice that goes through all these different types of meditation. And it's a really cool way to go deep within yourself and experience what it is to simply be. And so, coming out of that Wheel of Awareness exercise is where we're at in starting this portion of the recording and moving forward. I did edit some parts out just for some time. FYI, some breaks and things like that, and some comments from the folks in the group, which I don't necessarily think are exceptionally relevant or really that I'd want to share, because this is a group that we were in, and I don't want to share their portion of it. I want to share Dan's portion of it in the spirit of radical generosity. So, in my goal of bringing you to the cutting edge of who and what we are, which ultimately helps you reveal within yourself the truth of your identity and the truth of your existence and the reason that you exist in the first place. I present to you part two of Dan Siegel's talk in San Francisco, and it will be followed up by a part three in the next podcast as well. So I hope you enjoy this. This man is probably one of the most cutting-edge leading thinkers in the space of consciousness, being, science, and figuring out that whole consciousness and being thing through the eyes of science, which is critical because we're at a point now, and we're at a juncture now, and you'll hear him say this, actually, I think, in either part two or part three, but we're at a juncture now where science and spirituality are coming together like they never have before. And I will add that because of communications technology, you weren't able to be there in San Francisco, and you probably won't ever be in a position to listen to Dan give this talk to a private group somewhere. Now you can. Now you can share this. Now we can be in this space and help human evolution push forward. So I'm really stoked to present to you part two. Here we go.
This information that we just received, both in our own experience of doing the wheel practice and in those who articulate it with words, is going to be our grounding place of the data to say how can we actually apply these experiences that we have from the interior, if you will. Some people call it subjective experience because it really can't be known fully by anyone else but the person experiencing it. So the word subjective experience is used. And you may know that in science, subjective experience is the bane of science's experience, because they can't measure it and you can't objectify it. And so people throw out, in fact, about 100 years ago, the field of psychology tried to avoid subjective experience. The field of psychiatry, same thing. So that to be rigorous, you have to measure something. But by definition, subjective experience is not measurable. You can make estimates of it with a Likert scale and have people draw lines and all sorts of things, but those are just estimates. So we need to realize that there is something that's completely real that science has avoided. So I know I was asked here to talk about the science of whatever, mindfulness, but to be real about it, it has to be starting with subjective experience. So when I wrote The Mindful Brain and I put in one chapter purely about my subjective experience, I had actually people telling me that that was a violation of professional ethics. And they were going to cancel my contract for that book. They said it is unprofessional. In fact, it's unethical for you to put that chapter in. And they insisted I cut the chapter out. And luckily, a bunch of people had reviewed the manuscript and sent it to them right at the time I had to make a decision whether to end the book's life or to take the chapter out. And I decided to keep the chapter in, but at the same time, people said this is a useful book. Anyway, so the book now exists as it exists without any changes. So the issue is, what do we do with subjective experience? So what I'm going to do with us now in the next 8 minutes, bless you, is dive into the beginning of a discussion of explanation. So we went from description of first-person experience, was now a second-person reporting. We're now going to move a little bit into the third-person way. What I'm going to do is try to weave the sciences together, but always with an aim to practical application for you as a search inside yourself leader, institute, teacher. So you're going to see kind of both things happening. And to begin that, I just need to give you a teeny bit of background. And I'm going to give you references, not because when you sell a book, you make as an author, you make a quarter. Literally, you make about 25 cents. So I'm not like trying to make money for myself, but I have the full disclosure. I did write the books I'm about to tell you about, so I will get 25 cents if you buy one. So that's, whatever. I just want to say the field is called interpersonal neurobiology, and what it is it's a field where we combine all sciences into one discipline, one framework. So we take mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, sociology, linguistics, anthropology, all those fields and more, and we say, if each of them are like the blind man and the elephant looking at particular areas of reality, what if we made a whole elephant view? So that's what we did 22 years ago. And now I'm the editor of a series of books, the founding editor, where we've published 36 textbooks in interpersonal neurobiology. So if you read those books, you'll see an application for education or for psychotherapy, people for parenting. And outside of the Norton series on interpersonal neurobiology, if you wanted a textbook that reviews this field, it's called The Developing Mind, and you'll see a lot of the sciences that are backing up what I'm about to say. But for you, the most appropriate science review book would be something called Pocket Guide to Interpersonal Neurobiology, where it's a nonlinear book I wrote so that the experience of reading the book reflects what the topic of the book is about, which is about the mind. And the companion book for you would be not just a mindful brain, but actually a book called The Mindful Therapist, which could be called The Mindful Search Inside Yourself Leader Institute Teacher. I know that would be a silly title, but that would be a seriously silly name. But I call it The Mindful Therapist. It should have been just called The Mindful Teacher or The Mindful Person or something like that. And there you're going to see a deep, deep experiential discussion of what we're about to talk about. So, in this field, interpersonal neurobiology, what we do is we look at really issues that you may find kind of odd. I know for myself, I found them odd back in the 90s, early 90s, which was basically, it was the beginning of the decade of the brain, and I brought together a bunch of scientists to ask one question: what is the relationship between the mind and the brain? And it was fascinating. These 40 scientists represented every field I'm mentioning. I was the person who brought them in because, anyway, I knew them all, whatever, and I brought them in. And no one could decide on what the mind was. And short of just saying the mind is brain activity, which is, not accurate, it's what everyone says, but it's just not a complete picture. It may be partially true. The brain we could actually define. It's 100 billion neurons up in the head, and they have an average of 10,000 connections to other neurons, and basically, if you had to summarize the brain in a nutshell, it would be its patterns of electrochemical energy flow. That the patterns sometimes have symbolic value, which we call information. So the brain is an electrochemical energy transformation machine, if you will. It detects patterns, it does all sorts of things, and it's interesting, and we're going to talk more about it after the break. But what is the mind? So, 5 minutes. Here's the shocking reality. I've asked 100,000 mental health professionals, that is, health professionals focused on the mind. Had you ever been given a definition of the mind? Way over 95%, all around this planet, every discipline, never been given even one lecture on what the mind was. I've asked now 18,000 K through 12 teachers, same thing. 95% never been given definition of mind, but you say to an educator, when you're educating, I'm educating the mind. And I want to be clear, when I say mind, I don't mean mind is logic and heart is feelings or something. I don't mean that at all. I mean mind has to do with subjective experience, consciousness, anything that is about thoughts, feelings, memories, beliefs, attitudes, all the things we've been talking about. All this is the mind, perception. Even sensation of the body is called interoception. Ultimately, that's a mental activity. So that's really bizarre if you think about it. So what happened with me was I was kind of embarrassed. I was the training director in child psychiatry, and I was supposed to teach everyone about the mind's development in childhood and adolescence at UCLA, and I felt like I was a fake because no one ever mentioned to me what that was about. So I went on this driven search to find out, and then I was sad to find the field of psychology has no definition of the mind. The field of psychiatry, no definition of the mind. The field of anthropology, which studies the mind and culture, no definition of the mind. Sociology, no definition of mind. Even the field of philosophy of mind has no definition of mind, which is weird, of course.
What about Buddhism?
In Buddhism, they'll say it's a bunch of mental faculties, but ultimately, when I asked the Dalai Lama about it, there's no answer. There's descriptions, not definitions, I would say, but you can answer that. It's very interesting. Now we have the word, so some people say drop the word, but then what do you do with subjective experience? And what do you do with consciousness? Where does that belong? Well, people say it's brain activity. And this is, I'll suggest to you, the standard scientific line that if you want to know about the neural correlates, but I think there's more to it than that, but we can keep that as a, now that we're going to define the mind, we can talk about having an open mind about it. So this is a very interesting issue. It's just, you just need to know that. So for me, when I was in medical school, just to give you a teeny bit of the flavor of this, back in 1978, I had been a biochemistry major. When I had worked in college looking for enzymes that allowed salmon to go from freshwater to saltwater, and we found the enzyme. But at night, I was working on suicide prevention service, learning how the way you communicate with another human being in crisis could determine emotionally whether they give up and shoot themselves when they're on the phone with you or not. That emotional communication was as important to a human being as an enzyme was to a salmon. And I always felt there had to be some way of understanding the relational aspect of emotions and the enzymatic reactions in your molecular reality. So this is the 70s, 74, 75. So I came into medical school with that kind of unbelievable drive to find this link. And in medical school, where I went to medical school, they were researchers primarily, but they were teaching us clinical work. And they would treat patients as if they were bags of chemicals. And if you got a set of laboratory data and you went up to your patient who was dying and you said, as a professor, here's the lab data, you're dying, goodbye, I would pull on the coat of my attending. I don't know what they were attending to, but they're called attendings. And they were, and I would say, don't you want to ask about their feelings? And they would literally say to me, why? Why would I do that? Right? I was a very young kid. I was a young medical student. I was 21, 22. And I would say, because feelings are important. No, that's not what we do as doctors. I'd say, so I dropped out of school, did a bunch of different things. But one of the things I did was I made up this word in my head called mindsight. And I said to myself, if I go back there for school, I need to protect myself from those people as role models. That, I was a young person, I wanted to please my teachers. I said, but, you got to realize they are mind-sightless. They don't see anything that they can't observe with their eyes. So it's not just eyesight that is reality, it's mindsight. Mindsight is what you can see without your eyes. It includes, of course, your mental life, your feelings, your thoughts. So you would never say to a patient, you're just dying, there's nothing for me to do. You would realize that person has a mind, has a narrative center of gravity, has an internal subjective experience, has emotions, has meaning, has stories that are embedded in their whole life. So I went back to school with this word mindsight, and for me, this is now 1980, 81, I would always watch a professor and see, were they showing their ability, because I think every human being pretty much has the capacity but doesn't train it or doesn't exercise it or reveal it. Were they showing mindsight? And if they didn't, I would call them an anti-role model in my mind and say, that's a good example of what not to be like. and then look for people who were very, very far and few who had it. So when I left medical school and went into pediatrics and then psychiatry, I took this MindSight idea with me. This is now the early 80s. And I noticed that in pediatrics, families which had MindSight could do better. Sadly, if a kid got ill, they dealt with the illness in a much stronger way. They had more resilience. They could solve problems. They could be aware of the meaning for the child having leukemia, let's say. And we could have MindSight discussions. And everything was different that way. So when I left pediatrics and went into psychiatry, MindSight became the central organizing principle in my experience with my patients, so that what I need to do is teach them MindSight skills. And MindSight has 3 components. It has insight into yourself. It has empathy for the inner mental life of someone else. And as a 3rd component, which was essential to help have this whole thing make sense, and that 3rd component is called integration. And integration is defined as the linkage of differentiated parts. So MindSight basically is these 3 things. It's insight, it's empathy, broadly defined as just sensing another person's inner world, so that would include compassion. And the 3rd one is integration. So in the book Mark was referring to of Brainstorm, I teach the adolescent reading the book, or the adult, MindSight skills throughout the book, teaching them to have insight into themselves, empathy for others, and how to promote integration. So you say, well, what's integration? So integration is comprised of the differentiation of parts of a system, which means, like for 2 people, they would be able to be different from each other, differentiation. But then you're going to add a 2nd component besides differentiation, which is linkage. So when you have the linkage of differentiated parts of a system, like 2 people in a relationship, honoring differences, promoting linkages, then you get integration. And do we need to stop? Yes. So the last thing I'm going to say, if I could just take 60 more seconds, is that what's really interesting about integration is that when a system is integrated, integration basically leads to harmony. And when a system is not integrated, it's, if you imagine a river, one side of the river is chaotic, and the other side is rigid. So we're going to talk after the break about what this means in terms of our experience with the wheel of awareness, because ultimately, just to give you a little hint, this diagram is a picture of a table in my office, and what I did with my patients years and years ago around this table, there's this glass hub, there are these spokes that are actually the things that hold up the table, and there's this wooden rim, is I would pick them up from the couch, ask them to come up from the couch, walk them around the table, and I basically said, if every process of change in education or psychotherapy involves consciousness, which it does, that's a universal, it's very interesting, you need consciousness for change, which is fascinating. What if you took integration, which in my field we call the basis of health? For us, integration is health. So what if you integrated consciousness? So I walked them around the table and I said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to integrate consciousness now. We're going to differentiate the fundamental components of consciousness, are knowing and known. So we're going to differentiate those, knowing in the hub, known in the rim. And then we're going to systematically link them with the spoke, where you go around and you differentiate all the knowns from each other, but link them with the spoke. So if you said, where does this come from? This comes from the intention to integrate consciousness to deal with whatever a person was dealing with. And it's been used in that. And someone asked, is this a mindfulness practice? I didn't even know there was a thing called mindfulness when I invented this thing. But Jack Thornfield and John Kabat-Zinn, who've done this practice, and other people say that it would meet all the criteria for mindfulness practice. So it's not like it's in contrast to mindfulness, but it actually was created to be an integration of consciousness practice. So what's exciting about it for our purposes is we're going to see how the subjective experience of doing this integration of consciousness actually, for a one-time thing, can be useful for understanding mental life, but in the long run, this is extremely useful for dealing with all sorts of challenges to people's life. And the last thing I'll just say is, I wrote a book called Mindsight. That's another book you could read too. And Dan Goleman wrote the foreword to the book. And what Dan said in the foreword is that Mindsight is the mechanism beneath emotional and social intelligence. So if you had to say, what is emotional intelligence? Dan would say, it's mindsight. That, it says in the book, that mindsight is the fundamental mechanism of emotional and social intelligence. So then you get this really exciting moment where you can bring all sorts of things together, which we'll do after the break: mindfulness, emotional intelligence, and how we can teach this in the world. So we're going to now dive in the next hour and 10 minutes into an exploration of a number of different things. What I'd like to do is do what my dear friend John O'Donohue used to call a blast, which is just like a download of information. It'll be pretty short. So if there's a point of clarification during the blast, that's fine. Raise your hand, say I didn't understand what you just said, and I'll repeat it or try to clarify it. But then we'll have a discussion after a blast, and then we'll do another blast. So the first blast is about the question of what happened with the wheel of awareness, just from an experiential point of view. What can we say about subjective experience based on that internal practice of the wheel? Now, we ended before the break with this strange finding that no one has a definition of the mind. So we should just lay out a few findings from exploring the different disciplines. Number one is you are a pioneer of the mind, and no one has an answer to what the mind is. And that's just an amazing fact, I think. One of the most fascinating things. So every human being has this opportunity to explore this really undefined territory of mental life, which is very exciting. Number two, when it comes to questions of the mind and the brain, there is a stance in modern science that is very common to hear. So we should just state what that stance is, which is the mind is what the brain does. And scientists will feel comfortable with that because they can put a person in a scanner and show that when you have thoughts or emotions or memories, certain parts of the brain in a very predictable kind of way will generally get activated, and that's very exciting. If you have a tumor or an injury to certain parts of the brain, let's say from a stroke, in a pretty predictable way, certain functions are associated generally with certain regions. So that makes scientists feel comfortable saying the mind is what the brain does. What I want to suggest to you is that that view may be a partial truth, even though the scientists are stating it's absolute truth. It's the complete truth. So what I'm going to present to you now is inviting you to think outside that kind of mainstream view, but I want to urge you to be careful because in my experience teaching this over a couple decades now, it gets mainstream scientists so agitated that sometimes they will stand up in a room like this and start screaming at me that I'm destroying science by talking about what I'm about to talk about. Now, I am a scientist. I'm trained as a scientist. I used to do active empirical research. Now I'm mostly a practitioner and educator, but I'm thoroughly trained in science. So I have no problem with scientists getting upset and I talk to them about their feelings. Curious about that, actually. So we just have this funny phenomenon, Now, what we're about to do then is to go where generally mainstream academia doesn't go. And there's a beautiful book called The Mind in Context that came out in 2010 written by a number of revolutionary psychologists who basically state a similar thing that the developing mind, in broad strokes, was stating a decade earlier, which is that we need to look at the mind outside of just brain activity. We don't want to forget brain activity. So you were told you're going to hear about the neuroscience of mindfulness. I can tell you some things about it, but it really doesn't tell you that much in depth about it. Even if you find neural correlates of mindfulness and emotional intelligence, it's part of the story, it's not the whole story. So if you're looking for a whole elephant view, yes, you want to include any person who's been studying the toes, that's important, and the ankles, and the ears, you want to include everybody. And so to include everyone, for me, interpersonal neurobiology is a very useful way to go. So I'm just going to draw a couple things for you. The first is to invite you to consider that if you make a triangle and you say that our human experience is based on three aspects of one reality, and that would be, let's say, we'll call it the brain, but what we really mean here is the embodied brain, so the full body. But if you're from California, you have to be careful talking too much about the body, because people think you're not being scientific, but we'll just call it the brain. We have another thing that affects our mental life besides the brain and its whole body, which is relationships. And by relationships, we mean both a relationship you have with other people and also with the planet. Your connection of your bodily interior, if you will, with the relational world. And then we have this thing called mind. So this could be a 3-hour talk I'm going to give on this particular triangle, but it's going to be a 2-minute summary. But you just need to know there's a lot of depth to the science behind this. But if you have a room of 40 scientists that include anthropologists and physicists and neuroscientists, and ask them to say how is the brain related to the mind, relationships come into that. And these three elements, relationships, embodied brain, and mind, are three aspects of one reality. We're not separating them as different from each other. It's like if I handed you a coin, the coin has a heads, a tails, and an edge. It's one coin, 3 parts. Are the 3 parts related to each other? Yes. But it's one coin. What we're saying is the coin of human experience has at least 3 fundamental elements: relational, embodied, and mental. Now, this is where the scientists get pissed off. You're separating mind from brain. No, I'm not separating them. I'm just describing them. Subjective experience is not the same as ions flowing in and out of membranes. It may be completely dependent on it. It may be dependent on neurotransmitters firing across. But when you have subjective experience, it's not the same. Just like heads is not the same as tails. Same coin, different aspects. So one way of describing this is to call it a prime. That in reality we have things that are not reducible to anything else. And what I'm suggesting to you is that the mind, relationships, and the embodied brain are primes of experience. They aren't reducible. You don't reduce heads into tails and the edge. You have one coin, those are the parts of it. Okay, this at least keeps you from yanking out your hair saying, what's the mind, how it's related to the brain? Because we're going to define it. The brain, as we described earlier, 100 billion neurons up in the head, basically it's interconnected with the whole body. One way of describing what it's all about is electrochemical energy flow. And what's a relationship? A relationship is based on, bless you, a relationship is based on energy flow happening between people, the sharing or exchange of energy flow. So this would be an embodied mechanism of energy flow. An embodied mechanism. This is a sharing of energy flow. And sometimes that energy has a certain has has a pattern that doesn't have information in it, and sometimes it does. Like if I say the Golden Gate Bridge, right? That was just the same squiggling air molecules moving, but some energy patterns have information and some don't, right? And that's in foreign languages, right? So we heard a Japanese word. For those of us who don't speak Japanese, I can't remember what it was, but for those who do, you probably remember it because it has symbolic value. So we call that information. So you could use the word or the phrase, certainly this is all about energy, and some of that, so we can also say energy and information, because some energy patterns have information. Now the fact is, when I've talked to the world's leaders on information flow, you don't get information flow without energy, which is interesting. So it's a little redundant to say energy and information, and we use the word flow. Flow just means change across time. So this is a triangle of energy and information flow. The sharing of that flow is called a relationship. The embodiment of that flow. Let's have a bless you for everyone who's ready? 1, 2, 3. Bless you. Awesome. So we have the sharing of the flow, like just happened with all of us, with the sneezers. That's a relationship. That's how you set up a relationship. The embodied mechanism is, you can just call it brain if you want. So what is the mind? If this is a triangle of energy and information flow, what is the mind? What can we offer as a proposal, not a final statement, but a possible definition, a working definition, that would link energy and information flow, which is what this is about, with its sharing and its embodied mechanism. So, in this group I ran, back in 1992, the group was going to fall apart because everyone could not agree on what the mind was. The brain is easy, actually. The brain is actually complex, but it's pretty simple to state, right? The mind, no one had any agreement on it. The anthropologist, sociologist, the psychologist, the biologist, the geneticist, the neuroscientist, physicist, no one could agree on what mind was. You can describe it, your feelings, your thoughts, but if you say to someone, what's an emotion? They go, it's what you feel. Well, what's a feeling? It's what you have when you're emotional. You go, well, that actually doesn't help that much. What's a thought? Did you know that no one knows what a thought is? No one on the planet knows what a thought is. So this is very interesting, actually, since we have them all the time, but we don't know what they are. So, the mind. So I go for a walk on the beach. This group is going to implode. And I realized that there is a fundamental shared aspect of these two, at least, which is what? Energy and information flow. So I thought, what could the mind be? Now, the system we're talking about here is the system of energy and information flow. It's one system. Our beingness, if you want, our humanness, doesn't have to even be humanness, but it's just called beingness. It's about energy and information flow, and the system has three qualities. It is open to influences from outside of itself. So like if there were an earthquake right now, or there was a tragedy, what happened in Isla Vista happened, we heard about that. You can have things happen in Japan, you can have all sorts of things happen all over the world. So we are open systems. So that's the quality number one. We are open to influences from outside of what we define as the system. The second quality is we are nonlinear. And nonlinear means that small inputs lead to large and unpredictable results. And we are nonlinear. Just like a cloud would be open and nonlinear, we are too. And the third quality is called chaos capable. Are we capable of being chaotic? And do any of you feel like you're capable of being chaotic? Capable. Hello. Hello, right. So we're chaos capable. Now, if you have those three qualities, and chaos, one simple way of just defining chaos is complete randomness. That's not exactly right, but it's basically what we're talking about. So if you are chaos capable, nonlinear, and open, you get, in mathematics, the definition of being a complex system. I hope you're not sitting there going, oh, I want life to be simple, don't get it complex. Complexity is actually very simple. It's not the same as the word complicated. Complexity is actually elegantly simple. So, if you're open, nonlinear, and chaos capable, which this system is, you get the criteria of a complex system. And what I was reading about back in 1992 was that a complex system has what's called an emergent property. Emergence means something arises from the interaction of the elements of the system. And just as you're beginning to get a hint of the wheel of awareness practice, when you describe the interaction of seeing the pattern on the floor, and then the thing is organizing itself around, oh, I want to kind of find this thing, and they hold on to each other, that's a quality of an emergent property. Things start to bounce off each other, and it emerges from itself. You don't need a programmer. You don't need, like, Bill Gates' programmer to program emergence. It just happens out of the science of complex systems. One of the emergent properties of a complex system is called self-organization. It's not a California term, it's a math term. And self-organization is that emergent property, which of course, because it's emergent, is arising from the interaction of the elements of the system. And in this case, the system is energy and information flow. But for a cloud, it would be water molecules. And that's the emergent aspect of it. Self-organization means it comes back and it's going to regulate that from which it arose, which is completely counterintuitive, but it's completely predicted by math. It's called a recursive property. It's like a feedback loop. This recursive property you see all the time in human development. You see it in emotions, you see it in thoughts, you see it in behaviors, you see it in relationships. So the key issue here is the system that is giving rise to the emergent self-organizing process is not limited to the skin. The system we're talking about is not limited to the skin. It is energy and information flow happening right now among all of us, between me and you and among all of us in this room. It is what you're going to bring out into the world as a Search Inside Yourself Leader Institute teacher, and you are going to become a part of the system of the mind. So what I suggested to this group back in 1992, which I'll suggest to you right now, is the mind, besides subjective experience and consciousness, which we'll put to the side for now. They may be related, maybe not. We'll go back to the wheel soon. But let's just put subjective experience, the texture of felt moment-to-moment experience, and consciousness, this experience of being aware. Let's just put those to the side for now. This third aspect of the mind, we're defining as the emergent, self-organizing, relational, and embodied process that regulates the flow of energy and information. Let me put that up here.
Can you say that again?
Yeah. So it is, so here's a definition of a mind. And emergent, and that just comes straight out of a complex system. And the kind of emergent process is self-organizing. And that's a mathematical term, it's not just a feel-good term. And where is it? we'll just say it's embodied, meaning it's not just in the brain, it's in the whole body. It's embodied and it's relational. I'm losing my ink. Emergent, self-organized body and relational process. So it's a verb, not a noun. That, and here's the crucial thing, regulates the flow. Flow just means change across time of energy and information. Information being that subset of energy which has symbolic value. Period. Now, what was fascinating about this group of 40 scientists, 100%, without a dissenter, agreed that this met the criteria for everything they had been devoting their life to. So it was a way to take the blind man and the elephant and find a common elephant principle, if you will. What also becomes incredibly useful about this definition is you, as a Search Inside Yourself Leader Institute teacher, can teach people to regulate with more power. Because regulation involves two things that are teachable, completely teachable. So you say, hey, I want to strengthen the mind. You say, I'm going to strengthen the mind by, when you regulate a bicycle, what do? You steer it, exactly. You have to change its direction, you have to modify where it's going. What else do you do?
Power it.
And you power it, right. And what if we put you on the bicycle with blindfolds on?
Sense it.
You have to sense it, right. So you have to do two things. Regulation always equals monitoring. You have to monitor it or sense it, and you have to modify it or modulate it. Modify. So you're basically going to have the people you work with learn to strengthen their mind because you're going to teach them how to have a stronger regulatory capacity. You're going to teach them to monitor how? With more stability. So what they see has more depth, detail, and clarity. If you haven't stabilized the monitoring capacity of the mind, then what you see, like imagine if I had a camera, if we went out to the park and we were walking around, the camera was going like this, wasn't stabilized, what would the tape look like that we reviewed? How would it look?
Blurry.
It'd be blurry. And how could we edit it? You couldn't. It'd be a blurry mess. Most human beings are running around with a pretty blurry picture. And then you can't modify. But then you can say, well, hold on, you define the mind, that's fine. What is a healthy mind? So that's where the modification business comes in. It turns out that if you ask the question, what is optimal self-organization? There's an answer, amazingly. A complex system will optimize its flow across time. I'm just going to say this once. Jack has asked me never to say it because it gets everyone confused, but I'll just say it to you. In mathematical terms, you say it's maximizing complexity. That's the math term, and there's a good thing about that. People go, no, I don't want it to be more complex. But let me ask you a question. How many of you sing in a choir? One, how many? 1, 2, 3. Okay, 5, we have enough. Will you do a little demo for us, a quick demo?
Sure.
No. Come on, choir singers, come on. Let's see what they Come on up. Any choir singers, all right. Okay, so good. Well, can we have more than 4? No? 4 is going to be tough. All right. This is going to be your self-organizing demo. So what I'd like to do, Marilee, we're going to do 3 examples, and our task, all of us, will be just to feel what it feels like, each of the 3, and then we'll discuss the science of it. So Marilee, just pick a note, and what I like to do when I raise my hand, sing the note exactly the same way as Marilee does. And you can take a breath. Breathe, so. That went on for 3 hours. Okay, just to give you a feeling. It's a little hard, that's the hardest demo. Alright, now for the second demo, listen to the whole thing before you do any of it. So here are the instructions, and please listen to it because you're going to do it too so they can experience it also. Soon, I'm going to have you plug your ears so tight that you can't hear anyone else, but not yet. I'd like you to pick a song privately in your own internal world with words. And when I raise my hands, you're going to plug your ears really tightly and then belt out that song really loudly.
And with our ears plugged.
Yes, with your ears plugged.
Okay.
And then when I bring my hands down, you can stop. And you're going to be doing the same thing too, but just notice how this feels. Okay, you ready?
No, I don't have my song.
Okay.
Everybody has a song?
Think about a song.
I think of a song.
You
I'll
can't.
think of something.
Now you have to
Think
do
of
that.
something.
Are we all singing too?
No, they're doing it first, you'll do it next. You just listen. You're gonna think of a song and belt that really loud. Plug your ears. Very good. Get together and sing a song together. That'd be great. You can do harmony.
What do you think, guys?
Sabrina Amazing Grace.
Yeah, that's me, that's all.
Here's a pitch.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see.
Let's do it for our serious, silly singers. Thank you so much. Thank you. Beautiful. Wow. Wow. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Thank you.
Guess who the music maker?
Encore indeed.
Nice.
So let's first start with subjective experience. What did, if you can imagine the first example of just one note going on for hours and hours and hours, what would that be like? Boring. It would be boring. It would be called rigid, and we'll talk about the components of it soon. What about this second example? What did that feel like for you? Chaotic. And what did it feel like inside? Uncomfortable. Some people say it feels like home, but it's chaotic. Oh, yeah. So some people say very familiar. And what about the third example of Amazing Grace? What did that feel like just inside?
Harmony.
Touching, harmony. What did the sensation feel like for you?
Smooth.
Energized,
Pleasing.
tender, beautiful. Okay, great. So let's review each of these for the qualities of. We'll put it right here. So I use the paper. That we said that integration is a word we're going to use not in mathematics. They don't use the word the same way, but we're going to use it in regular language. Integration equals the linkage of differentiated parts. That's the definition of integration. So it's very specific. Differentiated parts. Okay, so let's do each example. Example number one, the same note. Was there differentiation? No. That's right, they were singing the same way. Now there were overtones, so it's this isn't a perfect example. Differentiation. Was there linkage? Yes. But to get integration, you need both differentiation and linkage. So that was not an integrated thing. And in that case, it went to, if it's not integrated, it can go to either chaos, if it's not integrated, or it goes to rigidity. I'm sorry, I'm kind of combining this graph to save paper. Rigidity. Okay, so that was an example of rigidity, not integration. How about example number two? Was there differentiation?
Yes.
Yes, right? Was there linkage? No. So was there integration?
No.
No. And what'd you get? Chaos. Let's do example number three. Was there differentiation? Yes, because they were singing in harmonic intervals. Was there linkage? Yes, they were singing the same song. Was there integration? Yes. And how did it feel? Bless you. Oh. Awesome. So that's harmony. Harmony. So harmony is what emerges with integration, literally. That's what Jack Clifton used instead of maximizing complexity. Now, it turns out that harmony has 5 qualities that come from the science of that spell the word faces. So you can just write these down, but they're flexible, F. A is adaptive. C is the mathematical term coherent. So it holds together well in a fluid way over time. C. E is energized. And S is stable. Flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable is this river of harmony, if you will, this faces flow. So you'll hear me just say faces flow, you know what I mean, flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. Now, integration isn't like a final thing, like you achieve it and you're done. It's something you're always moving toward in life, and complex systems have a natural movement to optimize self-organization, which is to create integration. They have a natural drive, if you will, to heal. And as a clinician or as a teacher, you need to know that each of us have a natural drive to integrate. But stuff gets in the way. We don't have the right training to monitor our energy and information flow, so it gets chaotic, so we can't modify toward integration. So sometimes just teaching to monitor with stability leads to integration. You don't have to do much more. But for many other people, you actually can teach to modify toward integration. And I'll give you examples of that in mindfulness practice. And for me, with this as a background since the 90s, you know, I didn't really understand what my supervisors were telling me to do so much, so I was just kind of feeling my way as a therapist. But ultimately, for me, psychotherapy that works is integrated. And you'll see a summary of that in the book Mindsight. And there are 9 domains of integration you can look at that can not reveal harmony, and they include integration of consciousness as the first one, and then there are 8 other ones we'll talk about. And let me just give you a couple of highlights of what this framework can give. Go back to the wheel of awareness, talk about search inside yourself leadership and what it means, not just for working in companies and individuals being better, but the whole company actually being more innovative, and even the whole planet moving toward a deeper sense of well-being. I know Mang calls it world peace, and I don't think he's so far off, actually. There's some deep notions of integration that when you think of ourselves as systems that are open systems, the work you're doing in search inside yourself, it's not just a pipe dream to say world peace. There's reason to believe that what we do with human consciousness can transform the path of our planet. And the idea, for me anyway, from a scientific point of view, is how do you actually empower that through the power of understanding the mind with its consciousness is actually the very place you can create integration. So when Dan Goleman wrote the foreword to the Mindsight, and he wrote, "This is the basis of emotional and social intelligence," this whole frame, I was very excited because you may not know this, but a couple years ago, there was really not a link between the field of emotional intelligence and mindfulness. In fact, I've been on a bunch of panels with Dan and with other people talking about how they've been separate. So in Search Inside Yourself, you're having this wonderful opportunity to be on the cutting edge of actually bringing those two together. For me, the way they come together is through Mindsight. They're actually both Mindsight practices. Emotional intelligence, social intelligence, and mindfulness, even though they seem so different on some level, they're all involving Mindsight. And since Mindsight is a teachable skill, then we're good to go. You said, okay, how do you actually teach these skills? So let me walk you through, let me see if there are any questions about that general frame, but then we're going to go back to the wheel of awareness, try to link it to some of the issues about emotional intelligence and emotions in general, and then see how the whole thing kind of fits together. Yes?
If the system is naturally driving towards integration,
Yep.
what part of the system is going towards non-integration? Because there's that energy there.
Yes, well, that's a great question. So there are a number of things that can happen. In my field, I'm an attachment researcher, so I study, not Buddhist kind of attachment, but the attachment between a baby and a parent. And what's fascinating about that is in my field, where we study strong, healthy relationships called secure attachment, our research findings, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, are basically between a parent, an attachment figure, and a baby, that relationship, if it's secure, our research findings are essentially identical to the research findings for mindfulness training. And so one of my graduate students, Amy DeNoble, actually went on a search and found, in fact, parents who are most likely to offer secure attachment without any particular training have mindfulness traits. So there you see this interesting relational thing, attachment, and mindfulness, a kind of internal presence that kind of go hand in hand. Now you say, so what gets in the way of either of those? So if you've had attachment experiences that have not been secure, you're less likely to have presence in your life, and mindfulness is one way of developing presence, but so you can have an attachment history that gets in the way. You can have a culture that's not promoting integration. So we have this strange thing in modern culture, which I'm gravely concerned about, which is that our modern culture is building on a human brain proclivity to have what Einstein called an optical delusion of our separateness. So when we think that the self is and constrained by the skin, that is, there's a Dan self in here, I don't know your name, but what's your name?
Kelly.
There's a Kelly self in you, and there's a Mark self and a Meg self, there's all these different selves. That's way too much differentiation. It's he didn't call it even an illusion, it's a delusion, a psychotic belief. I personally believe that it's the brain's vulnerability to have the delusion that the self comes from the body that is killing our planet.
Oh, yeah.
So people get me to talk, at climate change conferences now all the time. And I say, why are you having me talk at a climate change? I mean, I'm not a climatologist. They go, no, but you need to help. I say, well, why? What are you talking about? And I'll show up at the meetings. I say, tell me what's been going on. They go, well, we tried to inform people. It hasn't done anything. We tried to scare people, inconvenient truth. We got a Nobel Prize and an Academy Award, and Al Gore. And that made people less interested in helping. So we've informed them. We've tried to scare them. Nothing is helping. So I said, now you're asking me? They go, yeah. I go, oh my God. So I said, well, if informing them doesn't work, scaring you, then probably what you need to do is transform people. You've got to transform them from the identity of a separate me to also being a part of a we. So I use this term we, MWE, for the idea of having an integrated identity. And so part of it is a cultural message. Now, where do you get that message from? You get that message from your parents, who say, do well in school, get a good thing on the spelling test, and you beat out Billy and Joey next to you, get into this really great grade point average thing and get a good standardized score so you can get to the most competitive college, so you can get in the most competitive graveyard, It's freaking out. So with this brainstorm book, I read this book for adolescents because, we can try to tap into adults, that's important to do, but we got to get the next generation. So if you read the Brain Step, probably a good book to start with, because I said, look, there's an essence to the remodeling of the adolescent brain, and if we don't start allowing the adolescent generation to realize that this one huge impairment to integration is happening, that is the delusion of your separateness, that they're taught it by their parents, they're taught it by their schools, they're taught it by the media. Everything reinforces the idea that self comes from the body. So that's an example of too much differentiation, so you're blocking integration. So if we can expand that sense of identity and make it an integrated we, I think we can do this and really change things. So that's one example. Yes?
Can I just say really quickly, I'm kind of brought to tears right now because I really agree. And thank you.
Let me give you a hug.
I'm telling you, together, you can all put your arms around each other. I'm serious, this is something we need to do together.
We need to sing "We Are the World."
No, from a literally just talking to you as a scientist, but as a human being on the planet, this is something that it's time to do. And you are the vanguard of doing it. And we need to get out there and do this. And this whole issue, you're saying what blocks integration? This is exactly what we need to do. And we need to be fully present with our subjective experience. Say, I'm brought to tears. And we need to be able to be that present with reality. And let go of this family-produced, school-produced, culture-produced, media-reinforced delusion that we're separate from each other. Each of us sitting here, as you're going to see in a moment, are aspects of the same reality that we're going to talk about.
Okay, so wasn't that awesome? Part 3 is coming up in the next podcast episode, and you'll be able to get that in the next week or so when I put that out. And if you want to support this podcast, go to iamspirituality.com, make a contribution there. We're putting all that money into a bucket for world peace, and there is an actionable plan that we're working on. So you can make a contribution there. And all of those dollars, which are cash deductible, by the way, because we are a IRS recognized entity, can go to the push for world peace. And that's no joke, because with the communications technologies that have come out in the last number of years, we're now at a point where we can actually change the course of human history by getting the word out and teaching about inner peace and the practical path to inner peace, and about the mind, and about the source of our pain and suffering, and our trials and tribulations, and our differences, and the reason that we want to lash out at other people, that type of thing. When you start looking at that from a cognitive perspective, science shows that all that negative stuff gets tuned out almost immediately when you start looking at it from a how does it work perspective. So if you want to support us there, that's great. If you want to support us in another way, you can go to Audible and get a free book. Dan's books are on Audible. Brainstorm is one of them, which is about the developing mind of teenagers and how their stuff comes to be, which might be of interest to you parents. So go pick that up for free. audibletrial.com/iamspirituality. Or any other book, any other spirituality book. If you need a hint of what books to read, we do have a reading list at iamspirituality.com, so check that out. Hope things are well for you guys. Part 3 in about a week. Talk to you soon. Peace.